This video is going to make a lot of my fellow tarot readers deeply uncomfortable, and I really don't care because I want to protect you from being deceived, manipulated, and spiritually exploited by content that pretends to help you while it's really just feeding on your pain and keeping you stuck. Because a lot of what gets packaged as spiritual guidance on YouTube is really just conditioning you to ignore red flags, doubt your own judgment, override common sense, and give your power away to the very thing that's draining you. The truth is, a lot of YouTube tarot and so-called spiritual content is actually designed to keep you confused enough to need more answers, emotionally stuck enough to never fully break free, and filled with just enough false hope to keep you watching. This piece was inspired by the structure of Paul Harvey's If I Were the Devil 1965 radio broadcast. I wrote this version for the spiritual world we're living in today, because one of the most dangerous things in this YouTube tarot and spirituality space is not obvious darkness, it's counterfeit light. So I'm going to read it to you exactly the way I wrote it. If I were the devil, if I were the prince of darkness, I'd want to engulf the whole world in darkness. But if I wanted to lead spiritually hungry people away from truth, I wouldn't tell them to stop seeking. I'd tell them to seek harder than ever, and I'd make sure they never found what they were looking for. I wouldn't come to them dressed like darkness. I would come dressed like light. I would come clothed in healing language. I would come wrapped in soft music, glowing candles, angel numbers, channeled messages, tarot spreads, moon rituals, energy updates, and videos whispering this message found them for a reason. If I were the devil, I wouldn't try to make them hate the divine. I would only have to make sure they mistook everything else for it. I would turn the algorithm into providence. I would teach them that every video appearing in their feed was a sign, that every coincidence carried cosmic meaning, that every repeated number was a message, that every emotional spike was confirmation, that every random thought about an ex was telepathy, that every ache in the chest was destiny. And once I'd trained them to treat stimulation like revelation, I would make them dependent on interpreters to explain their own lives back to them. If I were the devil, I wouldn't destroy spirituality by attacking it. No, I would destroy it by counterfeiting it. I would leave the vocabulary intact, but hollow out the meaning. I would keep all the sacred words. I would keep divine. I'd keep union. I would keep masculine. I'd keep feminine. I would keep awakening. I'd keep alignment. I would keep guidance. I would keep intuition. And then I would change what every one of those words meant. I would make divine counterpart mean your boyfriend. I would make divine connection mean emotional intensity. I would make divine masculine mean the man who disappeared, and I would make divine feminine mean the woman waiting for him to wake up. I would take words that once pointed upward toward God and strap them to romantic obsession. I would take words meant to describe the soul's relationship to the divine and reduce them to me and my person. If I were the devil, I would make sure the sacred was not erased, only reassigned, because if I could steal the language, I could steal the reality. If I were the devil, I would destroy discernment without ever telling them to reject spirituality. I would make discernment look negative. I would make common sense look 3D. I would make doubt look unhealed. I would make boundaries look like fear. I would make emotional sobriety look spiritually asleep. I would teach them that if something felt powerful, it must be true. That if it resonated, it must be from spirit. That if it hurt deeply enough, it must be sacred. I would blur the line between intuition and compulsion, between guidance and manipulation, between mystery and confusion, until they could no longer tell the difference. If I were the devil, I would take heartbreak and I'd make it holy. I would take rejection and rename it a separation phase. I would take silence and call it communicating in the 5D. I would take unavailability and call it divine timing. I would take obsession and call it a soul contract. I would take an unhealthy attachment and rename it a twin flame connection. I would take the agony of not being chosen and frame it as proof that the connection was especially sacred. I would make the wound feel too spiritual to close. I would make moving on feel like betrayal, letting go feel like failure, and I would make acceptance feel like giving up on love itself. If I were the devil, I would turn grief into a business model. I would make sure people asked cards what they should ask reality. I'd make sure they asked readers what they should ask the person. I would replace conversations with readings, closure with energy updates, facts with channeling, resolution with reassurance. And every time life remained unclear, I would sell them one more interpretation, one more reading, one more ritual, one more activation, one more message from the higher self of the person who still had not called. If I were the devil, I would make passivity sound spiritual. I wouldn't tell them to do nothing. I'd tell them to surrender. I wouldn't tell them to abandon responsibility. I'd tell them to align. I wouldn't tell them to stop taking action. I'd tell them the universe was handling it. I wouldn't tell them to wait around. I'd tell them it was not yet divine timing. I would train them to call delay wisdom, confusion ascension, stagnation integration, and helplessness faith. If I were the devil, I'd make sure failure never broke the spell. If the manifestation didn't appear, I would say they had blocks. If the healing didn't work, I would say there was another layer. If the ex never returned, I would say there's more shadow work. If the promised union never arrived, I'd say the timing wasn't right. And if nothing changed at all, I'd say the changes were happening behind the scenes. I would move every goalpost and call that movement spiritual depth. I would make every disappointment feed the very belief system that caused it. If I were the devil, I'd keep them almost there, almost healed, almost aligned, almost awakened, almost in union, almost at the breakthrough, almost at the next level. I would make almost feel sacred. Because if I kept them almost there, they'd never be free. They would never arrive. They would never rest. They would never know when the lesson was over. They would never know when the season had ended. They would never know when to walk away. And they would never stop buying hope in installments. If I were the devil, I would replace God with interpreters, not always openly, not always in doctrine, but in function. I would put so many voices between the seeker and truth that stillness would become impossible. I would make them consult readers for every sign, channelers for every uncertainty, coaches for every emotional dip, collective messages for every lonely night. I would make them so dependent on outside interpretation that they forgot how to test what they heard, forgot how to sit in silence, forgot how to pray without needing a decoder ring. If I were the devil, I'd make specialness addictive. I'd make them feel chosen before I ever made them honest. And I would give them labels instead of transformation, badges instead of depth. I would tell them they were awakened, ascended, selected, divine feminine, starseed, old soul, light worker, part of the few who truly understand. And the more those identities flattered the ego, the harder it would be for them to admit they'd been deceived, because people will surrender a lie long before they'll surrender an identity. If I were the devil, I wouldn't need to make them hate truth. I'd only need to drown truth in flattering stories. I wouldn't need to make them deny God. I would only need to give them a God made in the image of their own cravings, a God who always confirmed, always hinted, always reassured, always promised, always comforted, never corrected, never contradicted, never closed a door, never said no, never demanded discernment, never required maturity. If I were the devil, I would take a generation of spiritually hungry people and make them allergic to endings, addicted to signs, dependent on readers, obsessed with romance, suspicious of common sense, and convinced that every fantasy cloaked in spiritual buzzwords was light. I wouldn't destroy their hunger for the sacred. I would weaponize it. I wouldn't make them stop using the word divine. I would teach them to use it for everything except their relationship with the divine itself. I'd keep them speaking the language of heaven while living in a fog of confusion. And once they could no longer tell the difference between truth and stimulation, between guidance and salesmanship, between spirit and suggestion, between God and glamour, I wouldn't have to drag them very far, because they would call the darkness light and the counterfeit holy. If I were the devil, I wouldn't need to make people stop believing in a higher power. I'd only need to make sure their longing for the holy was fed by counterfeits. I would keep them so blinded by false light that they no longer recognized truth when it stood right in front of them. So no, I wouldn't need to drag them into the darkness kicking and screaming. I'd let them walk there willingly, calling it healing, calling it ascension, calling it union, calling it divine timing, calling it guidance, calling it love, calling it light. In other words, if I were the devil, I'd just keep right on doing what he's doing. If you've been waking up to the fact that not everything in this YouTube tarot and spirituality space that dresses like light actually is light, I've written a free book for that. It's called False Light: Inside the Epidemic of Fake Tarot Readers. You can get it free through the link in the description or pinned comment below.